Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's how YouTube keeps sending you more chilling stories like this. And now, let the night begin with Story 1. The Renovation. I'll never forget the sound of that door opening for the first time. Wood scraping against stone, hinges screaming like they hadn't moved in decades. And the smell that rushed up from below, thick, sweet decay mixed with something else I couldn't name. I should have sealed it back up right then, but curiosity killed more than just cats, and I was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Let me back up. 3 months ago, I took a contract job restoring the interior of an old community center on Maple Street. The building used to be a church back in the 1800s, and you could still see traces of its original purpose in the high arched ceilings and stained glass windows that hadn't been boarded up yet. The pay was decent, $1,500 for 2 weeks of work, and I'd be working mostly alone during evening hours when the community programs weren't running. My name's Connor, and I've been doing renovation work for about 8 years now. I specialize in historic buildings, the kind of places where you have to work around original craftsmanship and century-old quirks. I'd restored plenty of old churches before, so when the project manager handed me the keys and blueprints, I figured this would be straightforward. Strip the old paint from the wooden pews, refinish the floors, update some electrical work. Nothing I hadn't done before. The first 2 nights went exactly as planned. I'd arrive around 6 p.m. after the after-school programs ended and the building emptied out. The space had good natural light filtering through those old windows, and even with the overhead fluorescence, there was something peaceful about working there. I could see why it had been a place of worship once. The acoustics were incredible. Every footstep, every scrape of sandpaper echoed in a way that made the building feel alive. But on my 3rd evening, I found something that wasn't on any of the blueprints. I was working on sanding down the baseboards in the back hallway when I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was tucked into an alcove behind where a large wooden cabinet had been moved earlier that day. The door itself was heavy oak, darker than the rest of the woodwork, with iron hinges that looked original to the building. There was no handle, just an old-style latch, and when I tried it, the door wouldn't budge. I checked the blueprints. Nothing. The architectural drawings showed that hallway ending in a supply closet, not another door, but here it was, clearly original to the building's construction, just sealed or forgotten over the decades. I called the project manager thinking maybe he'd know what was behind it. He sounded distracted when he answered, like I was interrupting something important. "Oh, that old thing," he said when I described it. "Probably just leads to a crawl space or old storage area. These church buildings, they've got spaces everywhere that nobody uses anymore. If it's locked, just leave it alone." But something about his tone bothered me. Too casual, like he was trying to dismiss it quickly. And when I asked if he had a key, he said no and hung up before I could ask anything else. I should have listened to him, should have left it alone and focused on the work I was being paid to do. But that door nagged at me for the rest of the evening. Every time I walked past it, I found myself staring, trying to figure out what could be behind it that wasn't worth mentioning in any of the building documentation. The next night, I brought some basic lockpicking tools. Nothing sophisticated, just the kind of thing any contractor learns to use when dealing with old buildings where keys have been lost to time. The latch was more stubborn than I expected, corroded from decades of disuse, but after 20 minutes of careful work, I heard the mechanism click. The door swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo from somewhere much deeper than it should have. Beyond the doorway was darkness and a set of stone stairs descending at a steep angle. I shined my flashlight down, but the beam seemed to get swallowed up after just a few steps. The stairs kept going, disappearing into blackness that felt unnaturally deep. That's when the smell hit me. Stale air, like a space that had been sealed for years, but underneath that was something sweeter. Organic. The kind of smell you associate with things left to decay in dark, damp places. I've worked in plenty of old basements, and they all have their own particular mustiness, but this was different. This was wrong. I stood there in that doorway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to decide whether to investigate or walk away. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was exactly the kind of situation where people make stupid decisions in horror movies. Unknown basement in an old building, weird smells, no cell service in the lower levels, all the classic warning signs. But the contractor in me was curious about the building's structure. How deep did those stairs go? Was this connected to the original church's foundation, or was it something added later? From an architectural standpoint, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I started down the stairs. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center, like countless feet had walked this path over the years. My flashlight beam revealed walls of fitted stone, definitely original construction, but the craftsmanship was different from the rest of the building. Rougher, more utilitarian. These weren't meant to be seen. About 20 steps down, I realized I should have hit the building's foundation level, but the stairs kept descending. According to the blueprints, the community center sat on a standard basement foundation, maybe 8 feet deep, but I'd already gone down at least 15 feet, and there was no sign of the bottom. The smell was getting stronger. That sweet decay scent was mixing with something else now, something that reminded me of old leather and metal. And underneath it all was an odor I couldn't identify, but it made my skin crawl in a way that bypassed rational thought and went straight to primitive instinct. 30 steps, 40. The walls were getting damper and I could see moisture beading on the stone. My flashlight beam finally hit something. Not the bottom of the stairs, but a landing. The stairs turned 90 degrees and continued down into darkness that seemed to actively resist my light. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this deep underground. But what was surprising was the temperature reading on my weather app. 62 degrees. It had been 78 degrees upstairs, and basements are usually cooler. But this felt like more than just natural temperature differential. On the landing, I found something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the stone wall, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were symbols. Not letters or numbers, but geometric shapes arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, like they were moving when I wasn't watching them directly. And below the symbols, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were tally marks. Hundreds of them arranged in groups of 5, covering a section of wall about 3 feet wide. Someone had been keeping count of something down here. That's when I heard the first sound that didn't come from me. It was subtle, a scraping noise like something heavy being dragged across stone. It came from somewhere below, echoing up through the darkness in a way that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling or old pipes adjusting to temperature changes. The scraping came again, more deliberate this time, rhythmic, purposeful. I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, to seal that door behind me and forget I'd ever found it. But something kept me frozen on that landing, listening to sounds that couldn't be explained by anything rational. My flashlight flickered, not dead batteries, but the kind of electrical interference that happens around strong electromagnetic fields. In the brief moments of darkness between flickers, I thought I saw something move in the stairs below. A shadow that was darker than the surrounding blackness, shifting against the stone walls. When my light stabilized, I was alone again. But the scraping had stopped, replaced by a new sound that made my heart pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. Breathing, deep, labored breathing echoing up from the depths below, like something large trying to catch its breath after exertion. I ran. I took those stairs 3 at a time, not caring if I tripped, not looking back, focused only on reaching that door and getting back to the world of fluorescent lights and normal smells and rational explanations. Behind me, I heard something that might have been footsteps on stone, but I didn't slow down to listen. I slammed the door shut and threw the latch, then dragged the heavy wooden cabinet back in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the cabinet's edges, but adrenaline gave me strength I didn't know I had. I called in sick the next day, told the project manager I had food poisoning and needed 24 hours to recover. But really, I spent that day researching everything I could find about the building's history. What I found didn't make me feel better. The community center had been built on the site of St. Margaret's Church, constructed in 1847. But St. Margaret's had been built on the foundation of something older, a meeting house from the 1780s that had been destroyed in a fire. And before that, the land had been used for purposes that the historical records only referenced obliquely, mentioning community gatherings and traditional observances that predated the town's official founding. In 1923, St. Margaret's had been abandoned suddenly. The parish records cited structural concerns and atmosphere unsuitable for worship. But newspaper accounts from that time mentioned strange incidents. Congregation members reporting unexplained sounds during services. The building had sat empty for 30 years before being converted into a community center in 1953. And even then, the conversion had been limited to the upper levels. The basement had been sealed and excluded from all renovation plans, until someone had unsealed it. I finished the renovation job, but I never opened that door again. I worked faster than I'd ever worked before, skipping evening shifts in favor of early mornings when the building felt safer. Every time I walked past that hallway, I could smell something faint but wrong seeping around the edges of the cabinet I'd pushed against the door. The project manager seemed relieved when I finished early. He paid me in full and mentioned that they'd decided to postpone any basement renovation indefinitely. I moved to a different part of the state 6 months later. Found work restoring Victorian houses instead of churches or community buildings. But sometimes late at night when I'm working alone in old spaces, I catch a whiff of that same sweet decay smell. And I have to stop what I'm doing and check every door, every entrance, making sure nothing has been opened. That should stay closed. Because I know now that some doors aren't locked to keep people out. They're locked to keep something else in. And once you've opened one of those doors, once you've walked down those stairs into spaces that exist deeper than they should, you never really forget what it feels like to realize you're not alone in the darkness. I still wake up some nights remembering that scraping sound and wondering what would have happened if I'd kept walking down those stairs. What was keeping count with all those tally marks? What was breathing in the darkness below? I don't want to know, but sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, I think it knows me now, and one day it might come looking. Story 2. The Volunteer Shift. The child's drawing showed me standing in the basement, but I'd never seen a child down there. Not once in the 3 weekends I'd been volunteering. The drawing was in red crayon, stick figures, but detailed enough that I could recognize the layout of the donation room, the arrangement of boxes I'd organized, even the old furnace in the corner. And there I was, a simple figure with brown hair, standing exactly where I'd been sorting clothes just an hour before. Dated 3 weeks ago, tucked inside a donated Bible that I'd handled myself. But I'd been the only one with the key. Let me explain how I got into this situation. My name's Ashley, and I volunteer with the Millbrook Community Outreach Program. It's nothing fancy. We collect donations for local families in need and distribute them through our food bank and clothing drive. The organization has been using the basement of the old Millbrook Community Hall since 1987, and it's always been a one-person operation down there because of space constraints. The hall itself was built in 1847, one of those sturdy stone buildings with thick walls and small windows that were designed to last forever. The main floor hosts town meetings and small events, but the basement belongs to us volunteers. That's where all the donated items get sorted, cataloged, and stored before distribution. I'd been volunteering with the organization for 2 years, but always on the main floor helping with intake and client services. When Margaret, our longtime basement coordinator, moved to Florida last month, they asked if I'd take over the donation room. The work wasn't complicated, just needed someone reliable who could spare a few hours on weekends to keep things organized. The job came with its own key to the basement entrance, a heavy iron thing that looked original to the building. Margaret had handed it to me personally, along with a quick orientation about the storage system and a few warnings about the old building's quirks. The basement got damp in heavy rain, the electrical was touchy, and the stairs were steep enough that I should always use the handrail. "Oh, and Ashley," she'd said as I was leaving that first day, "you might hear some settling noises down there. Old buildings, you know. Don't let it spook you." The first weekend went perfectly. I spent Saturday afternoon sorting through 3 boxes of winter coats and a collection of children's books that someone had donated. The basement was exactly what you'd expect: low ceilings, stone walls, that particular musty smell that comes with age and moisture. Not unpleasant, just distinctly underground. I set up a system with clearly labeled boxes and made a detailed inventory list for the other volunteers. When I came back the following Saturday, I found my neat stacks of boxes had been moved, not dramatically, not obviously. But I have what my friends call an obsessive attention to detail, and I knew exactly how I'd left everything. The box of children's books had been moved about 3 feet to the left. The winter coats were still folded, but they'd been restacked in a different order. Small changes, the kind of thing most people wouldn't even notice. My first thought was that another volunteer had come down to get something during the week. That made sense. People need access to donations for emergency situations, and Margaret had mentioned that a few other volunteers had basement keys for exactly that reason. I made a mental note to ask around about it, and continued with my work. I spent that day organizing donated household items and setting up a better labeling system for the metal shelving units along the far wall. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. There's something satisfying about bringing order to donated chaos, turning random acts of generosity into a system that can actually help people. But when I returned the following weekend, the changes were more obvious. The box I'd labeled kitchen items, pots and pans, had been opened, and its contents scattered across the nearest table. Not dumped out, but arranged in a deliberate pattern that I couldn't understand. Spatulas and wooden spoons laid out in parallel lines, measuring cups nested in a way that created geometric shapes. It looked almost decorative, like someone had been playing with the items rather than searching for something specific. More disturbing was what I found in the children's clothing section. I'd spent considerable time the previous weekend organizing donated kids' clothes by size and season. Now I found items moved from their designated boxes and arranged on the old armchair in the corner. A complete outfit, sized for about a 7-year-old, laid out as if a child had been wearing them and simply vanished, leaving the clothes behind in perfect arrangement. I checked with the other volunteers on Monday, left messages, sent texts, asked around about who might have needed access to the basement over the weekend. Nobody had been down there. In fact, most of the other volunteers didn't even know where their basement keys were. since Margaret had handled everything herself for so long. The building supervisor confirmed that no one else should have access. The main entrance to the hall was locked on weekends, and the only way into the basement was through the exterior door that matched my key. He suggested maybe I was misremembering how I'd left things, or perhaps the building's settling had shifted some items on the shelves. That explanation might have satisfied me if not for what happened the next weekend. I arrived Saturday morning to find evidence of more extensive activity. Multiple boxes had been opened and their contents reorganized according to some system I couldn't decipher. Books arranged by color rather than subject, clothes sorted by pattern rather than size. Kitchen utensils grouped in ways that made no logical sense for donation distribution. But the most unsettling discovery was in my volunteer logbook. I kept detailed records of my activities, time spent, items processed, observations about donation quality, essential information for grant reporting and volunteer coordination. When I opened the notebook that Saturday, I found entries I hadn't written. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, nothing like my own casual scrawl. Someone had made detailed observations about my work habits, noting what time I typically arrived, how long I spent on different tasks, which areas of the basement I focused on each week. The entries were written as if someone had been watching me work, taking notes on my routine from somewhere in the shadows. The final entry, dated the previous Saturday, simply read, "Subject appears unaware of observation." My hands were shaking as I read those words. Someone had been down here while I worked, watching me, taking notes, treating my volunteer time like some kind of research project. But that was impossible. I would have noticed another person in the basement. The space wasn't that large, and I'd been alone the entire time. I called the building supervisor immediately. He arrived within 30 minutes, bringing a police officer with him. We searched the entire basement together, looking for any evidence of unauthorized entry or hidden spaces where someone might have been concealing themselves. What we found was worse than evidence of an intruder. Behind the furnace, in a space I'd never noticed because it was blocked by storage shelves, we discovered a small area that had been set up like a makeshift observation post, a folding chair positioned to provide a clear view of the main work area, a notebook filled with detailed observations about not just my activities, but Margaret's work patterns over what appeared to be several months before her retirement. And photographs, dozens of them, taken with a long lens through the basement's small windows. Pictures of me sorting donations, organizing boxes, taking inventory. Pictures of Margaret doing the same work, all taken without our knowledge, documenting our every movement in what we'd assumed was a private workspace. The police treated it as a breaking and entering case, but they couldn't determine how someone had been getting in. The locks showed no signs of tampering. The windows were too small for adult entry and were secured from the inside. The building supervisor checked and rechecked his records. Only 3 people had basement keys, and I was the only one who'd been using mine. That should have been the end of it. The police advised me to vary my schedule, recommended that the organization install a security camera in the basement, and suggested I always volunteer with a partner for safety. Reasonable precautions for an unreasonable situation. But I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about those photographs, the detailed observations, the careful way someone had been monitoring my routine. It felt personal in a way that random breaking and entering shouldn't feel. Targeted, intentional. I decided to set up my own surveillance. The following Saturday, I arrived early and placed a small digital camera in a concealed position near the ceiling, aimed at the main work area. Motion activated, designed for home security, capable of recording several hours of footage. If someone was getting into the basement, I was going to document it. I spent the day working as normally as possible, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Every sound seemed amplified in the underground space, my footsteps on the concrete floor, the rustle of clothes as I sorted them. Even my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. But I completed my usual tasks and left the camera running when I locked up that evening. On Monday, I retrieved the camera and reviewed the footage on my laptop at home. For the first 3 hours, the recording showed exactly what I expected. Me working alone in the basement, moving between boxes, organizing donations, making notes in my logbook. Normal volunteer activity in an empty space, but at 3:17 p.m., while I was focused on sorting books in the far corner of the room, the camera captured something that made me understand why I'd never seen the intruder. A section of the stone wall near the old furnace opened inward like a door, not a door that had been cut or modified, but an original feature of the building's construction. So perfectly fitted to the surrounding stonework that it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. A child emerged from the opening. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dressed in clothes that looked decades old. A simple dress, knee socks, shoes that belonged in a museum exhibit about mid-century childhood. She moved through the basement with the confidence of someone who knew the space intimately, picking up items I'd been working with, examining them carefully before setting them down in new arrangements. She was the source of all the reorganization that had been puzzling me. Not malicious mischief, but the methodical curiosity of a child exploring a space that interested her. She touched everything I'd touched, rearranged things according to some logic that made sense to her, but not to adults focused on practical distribution systems. And she watched me work. The camera captured her standing in the shadows near the hidden door, observing my movements with the intense focus that children bring to studying adult behavior, taking mental notes that she later translated into careful handwriting in my volunteer logbook. The most chilling part was how she interacted with my work area. She sat in my chair, mimicked my sorting motions with donated items, even picked up my pen and practiced copying my handwriting in the margins of old newspapers. She was learning to be me, or at least learning to replicate my patterns and behaviors. The recording showed her working in the basement for almost 2 hours after I left, continuing the organizational tasks I'd started, but according to her own mysterious system. She seemed completely at home in the underground space, moving between the storage areas and her hidden alcove like someone who'd lived there for years. At the end of the footage, she returned to her concealed entrance, but not before placing something on my work table. When I watched closely, I could see it was a drawing. The red crayon picture I'd found tucked inside the donated Bible. She'd drawn me working in the basement 3 weeks ago, before I'd ever suspected I was being observed. The drawing was her way of communicating, of letting me know that she'd been there all along, watching and learning and trying to understand the world of adult volunteer work that happened in her underground domain. I never went back to the basement. I called the organization and resigned from the donation room coordination, citing personal scheduling conflicts. I recommended they find someone else, preferably someone who worked in pairs and kept more irregular hours. I didn't mention the recording or the hidden door or the girl who lived in the walls of a 170-year-old building. Because what could I say? That a child had been living in the basement of the community hall, emerging to play with donated items and study adult volunteers? That she'd been there for months, maybe years, surviving in hidden spaces behind stone walls that opened like secret passages? No one would believe it. And even if they did, what then? Social services investigation? Police searches? Media attention? The disruption of whatever strange existence that girl had carved out for herself in the forgotten spaces of an old building? I think about her sometimes, wondering if she's still down there, waiting for the next volunteer to establish a routine she can study and replicate. Wondering if she misses having someone to watch, someone whose patterns she could learn and whose handwriting she could practice copying. I hope whoever replaced me in the donation room is kind. Because I think that girl, whoever she is, wherever she came from, is just trying to understand how to be part of the world above ground. And maybe in her own way, she was trying to help with the work we do down there, organizing donations for families in need. But I still can't shake the image of that drawing, the careful way she documented my presence in her space. She'd been watching me long before I knew she existed. And somewhere in the basement of that old building, she's probably still watching, still learning, still practicing how to be human. I just hope the next volunteer is prepared for the feeling of never being quite alone. Story 3. The Night Custodian. The singing stopped the moment I stepped inside, like whoever was down there had been waiting for me to join them. But the archives room was empty. Just rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes, the same setup I'd seen during my day shift orientation. Empty, except for the lingering warmth in the air and the sense that I'd interrupted something sacred and secret, something that had been happening in that basement long before I'd started working there. My name's Derek, and I took the night custodian job at the Riverside Historical Preservation Society because the pay was decent and the work was straightforward. Clean the building, secure the entrances, make sure nothing got stolen or damaged overnight. The society operates out of a converted meeting hall that dates back to 1865. Beautiful stonework, high ceilings, the kind of architectural craftsmanship you don't see anymore. The building houses the county's historical records, genealogical research materials, and a collection of artifacts from the area's early settlement period. During the day, it's busy with researchers, genealogists, and history buffs digging through archives. At night, it was supposed to be just me and the ghosts of local history. The job interview had been brief. The director, a woman named Mrs. Paulson, who'd been with the society for 30 years, showed me around the main floor and explained the basic security procedures. Lock the front entrance by 6 p.m., set the alarm system, do a final walkthrough by 10 p.m., then settle in for the overnight shift in case of emergencies. The building has some quirks, she'd mentioned as we finished the tour. Old heating system makes noises, especially in winter. Pipes settle, wood expands and contracts. She'd handed me a ring of keys and a basic floor plan, but when I asked about the lower level, she'd gotten oddly specific. The archives room is downstairs, but you won't need access to that area after 10 p.m. The heating system down there gets unpredictable at night, makes all sorts of racket. Better to just avoid it entirely. That seemed reasonable. I'd worked in old buildings before, and they all had their quirks and no-go areas. The important thing was steady employment and health insurance, both of which this job provided. My first week was exactly what I'd expected. Arrive at 6 p.m., lock up the building after the last researchers left, spend the evening cleaning and doing light maintenance work. The building was peaceful at night, the kind of quiet that comes with thick stone walls and decades of respectful slants. I could understand why people found it conducive to research and contemplation. The heating system did make noises, just like Mrs. Paulson had warned. Clicking, settling sounds that echoed through the building's bones. Old radiators adjusting to temperature changes, pipes expanding and contracting as the system cycled on and off. Nothing unusual for a building that had been heating itself for over a century and a half. But on my second week, I started noticing sounds that didn't quite fit the pattern of mechanical heating system noise. It started around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I was mopping the main floor when I heard what sounded like voices coming from below. Not conversation exactly, but something rhythmic and melodic. Almost like singing. but too faint and muffled to make out individual words or even determine how many voices were involved. My first thought was that someone had left a radio playing in the archives room. Researchers sometimes worked late, and maybe someone had forgotten to turn off background music when they finished for the day. I made a mental note to check the lower level during my next round, even though Mrs. Paulson had suggested avoiding it after 10 p.m. The sound continued for about 20 minutes, then faded away so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it stopped. By the time I finished mopping and was ready to investigate, the building had returned to its normal nighttime quiet. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Paulson the next morning, she nodded knowingly. "Probably just the heating system echoing through the ductwork," she said. "Sound carries strangely in old buildings, especially between floors." That explanation satisfied me until it happened again 2 nights later. This time I was closer to the stairway that led to the lower level, and the sound was clearer, definitely voices. Multiple voices singing in harmony. Not a radio or recorded music, but live human voices with the slight imperfections and variations that come with real-time performance. The melody was unfamiliar. Not a hymn or folk song I recognized, but something with a haunting, repetitive structure that seemed designed for group participation. The kind of song that builds layers as more voices join in, creating complex harmonies that resonate in stone-walled spaces. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The archives room was supposed to be empty. The building was locked. The alarm system was set, and I hadn't seen anyone leave through the main entrance after hours. But those voices were definitely coming from the lower level. I should have called Mrs. Paulson immediately, should have followed protocol for potential security breaches and contacted the police. But something about the singing made me hesitate. It wasn't threatening or alarming. It was beautiful, in a way that made me want to understand rather than interrupt. I made the decision to investigate personally. The stairway to the lower level was narrow and steep, with stone walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My flashlight beam revealed the same setup I'd seen during my initial orientation. A long corridor with the archives room at the far end, storage areas branching off to either side. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the singing that grew clearer with each step I descended. The voices were coming from the archives room, and they were singing in what sounded like multiple languages. I caught fragments of English, but also syllables and phrases that belonged to languages I couldn't identify. The harmonies were complex, sophisticated, the kind of musical arrangement that requires practice and coordination. The archives room door was closed but unlocked. During the day, researchers could access it freely, but Mrs. Paulson had been clear that it should remain secure after hours. Someone had either forgotten to lock it, or someone was inside with authorized access that I hadn't been told about. I approached the door carefully, trying to determine how many people were in the room without announcing my presence. The singing suggested at least 6 or 7 voices, maybe more, all adult voices with the trained quality that comes from regular group singing experience. When I reached the door, I paused with my hand on the handle, listening to what had become the most beautiful and unsettling musical performance I'd ever encountered. The harmonies seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the stone walls themselves, as if the building had been designed to amplify and enhance this particular type of musical expression. That's when I realized the music had been gradually getting louder and more complex as I approached. Like the singers were aware of my presence and were drawing me closer with increasingly intricate melodies. I opened the door. The singing stopped instantly. Not a gradual fade or natural ending, but an immediate, complete silence that left my ears ringing in the sudden absence of sound. The archives room was empty, completely empty. Just the familiar rows of filing cabinets, storage boxes arranged on metal shelving, research tables and chairs positioned exactly as they'd been during my daytime orientation. No people, no evidence that anyone had been there recently, no explanation for the elaborate musical performance I'd been hearing for the past 15 minutes. But the air in the room felt different, warmer than the rest of the lower level, with a quality that suggested recent occupation by multiple people, and there was a lingering sense of presence, like walking into a space immediately after a crowd has departed. I searched the entire room methodically, checked behind filing cabinets, looked under tables, examined every possible hiding place large enough to conceal a person. Nothing. The room was definitively empty, and there was no other exit besides the door I'd entered through. I checked the adjacent storage areas, searched the entire lower level, looking for any evidence of people who might have been singing in the archives room just minutes before. The basement was as empty and secure as it should have been, with no signs of unauthorized access or recent activity. When I returned to the archives room, I found something I'd missed in my initial search. On one of the research tables, someone had left a single sheet of handwritten music, not photocopied or printed, but carefully written by hand in ink that looked decades old. The musical notation was complex, written for multiple vocal parts in a style that seemed much older than contemporary sheet music. The same year, the building had been constructed as a meeting hall, 18 years before it was converted for historical preservation use. I took the sheet music with me when I completed my rounds, and the rest of the night passed quietly. No more singing, no unusual sounds from the lower level, just the normal settling noises of an old building adjusting to temperature changes. But I couldn't stop thinking about those voices. The complexity of the harmonies, the way the music had seemed to respond to my presence. The immediate silence when I'd opened the door, and the sheet music with its 1847 date and elaborate vocal arrangements for a song I'd never heard performed anywhere else. I researched the building's history during my off hours. What I found added context to my nighttime experience, but didn't make it any less unsettling. The acoustics of the stone-walled structure had been specifically designed to enhance vocal harmonies, with architectural features that naturally amplified and resonated human voices. The building had sat empty for several years before being purchased by the Historical Preservation Society, which had found it ideal for archival storage due to its excellent acoustics and temperature-stable lower level. And for the past 160 years, researchers and staff had occasionally reported hearing unexplained vocal phenomena in the archives room, usually during evening hours when the building was otherwise empty. I lasted 3 more weeks in that job, 3 more weeks of beautiful, impossible singing that started around 11 p.m. and stopped the moment I approached the archives room. 3 more weeks of finding handwritten sheet music on research tables, each piece dated 1847, and each featuring increasingly complex vocal arrangements. And 3 more weeks of feeling like I was being invited to join something that had been waiting patiently for the right person to complete their musical circle. On my final night, the singing was different. Instead of the elaborate harmonies I'd grown accustomed to, I heard a single voice calling from the archives room. Clear, compelling, unmistakably female, singing a melody that seemed designed specifically to draw me downstairs. I knew it was Constance Whitmore. I knew she'd been waiting in that basement for over 1.5 centuries, leading her community in eternal vocal meditation, looking for new voices to join their harmonic spiritual expression. And I knew that if I went down those stairs one more time, if I opened that door while she was calling, I might find myself becoming a permanent part of their musical arrangements. I left my keys on Mrs. Paulson's desk and walked out of that building for the last time. 6 months later, I heard that they'd hired a new night custodian, a young guy named Michael who was interested in local history and didn't mind working alone in old buildings. I wonder if he's learned about the singing yet. I wonder if he's found the sheet music, and I wonder if someday, when the archives room needs just one more voice to complete their eternal harmonies, he'll be the one who finally opens that door and doesn't come back upstairs. Because I know they're still down there practicing their songs, waiting for someone who appreciates the beauty of what they're creating enough to join them permanently. Sometimes I still hear echoes of their music in my dreams, and I wake up humming melodies I don't remember learning. Story 4. The Historical Society Tour. In the last photo I took, one of them was standing directly behind me. I could see my own shadow on the stone wall, cast by the camera's flash, and right there beside it was another shadow, taller, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, reaching toward me with arms that seemed too long to belong to any living person. But when I'd taken that picture, I'd been completely alone in the archive's basement. At least that's what I'd thought. It's not a big operation. Just me with a camera and a passion for documenting the forgotten corners of our area's past. I focus on buildings and places that have stories to tell, the kind of locations that tourists drive past without realizing they're looking at pieces of living history. When I heard that the Millfield Historical Society was housed in the town's oldest continuously standing building, I knew I had to feature it. The structure dated back to 1859, originally built as a community meeting hall, and it had served various civic functions over the past century and a half. The society had been using it for their archives and research collections since 1967. Getting permission to photograph the interior took some persistence. The society's president, an elderly man named Robert Chen, seemed hesitant about allowing a blogger access to their collection areas. He mentioned insurance concerns and the fragility of some archived materials, but eventually agreed to let me document the building's architectural features for historical preservation purposes. "You can photograph the main floor freely," he'd said during our phone conversation. "And if you're interested in the basement archives for your story, I suppose that would be acceptable, though I should mention that the lighting down there isn't great for photography." He scheduled my visit for a Thursday afternoon when the society would be closed to researchers, ensuring I could work without disturbing ongoing projects. I arrived at 2 p.m. with my camera equipment and a basic understanding of the building's layout from the Historical Society's promotional materials. The main floor was exactly what I'd expected from a 19th century meeting hall. High ceilings, tall windows, original woodwork that had been maintained beautifully over the decades. I spent about an hour photographing architectural details in the Society's historical displays, getting excellent shots that would work perfectly for my blog article. Robert met me around 3 p.m. to provide access to the basement archives. He seemed nervous as he led me to a door I hadn't noticed during my main floor photography, tucked behind the reception desk, almost hidden unless you knew where to look. "The archives are down here," he said, producing a large iron key that looked original to the building. "Take your time, but I'd prefer if you could finish before sunset. The building gets..." He unlocked the door and switched on a stairway light that barely illuminated the steep stone steps leading down into darkness. "I won't be able to stay with you," he continued, checking his watch. "I have a board meeting to attend across town. Just lock up when you're finished and drop the key through the mail slot." Something about his tone made me pause. He seemed eager to leave, almost like he was relieved to hand over responsibility for the basement to someone else. I asked. "Just photograph whatever interests you," he said quickly. "The stonework down there is original to the building. Excellent examples of mid-19th century craftsmanship." He left so abruptly that I wondered if I'd inadvertently agreed to something more complicated than a simple photography session. But I'd driven 40 minutes to get there, and the opportunity to document a space that few people ever saw was exactly the kind of content my blog readers appreciated. I gathered my camera equipment and headed down the stairs. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with a ceiling high enough that I didn't feel claustrophobic despite being underground. The stonework was indeed impressive. Fitted blocks that had been laid with the kind of precision that modern contractors charge premium prices to replicate. The archives themselves were organized efficiently, with metal shelving units containing dozens of document boxes and filing systems that clearly represented decades of careful curation. But Robert had been right about the lighting. The basement had small windows near the ceiling that provided minimal natural light, and the overhead fluorescents were old enough that they cast everything in a yellowish, uneven glow. Perfect for creating atmospheric photos, but challenging for getting the kind of sharp architectural documentation I usually preferred. I started with wide shots of the overall space, then moved to detail photography of the stonework and archival storage systems. My camera's flash was working overtime to compensate for the poor ambient lighting, and I was getting exactly the kind of dramatic contrasts that would make my blog article stand out. About 30 minutes into the session, I noticed something odd in my camera's LCD screen. In several of the photos I'd taken, there appeared to be shadows in the background that I hadn't noticed while composing the shots. Not equipment shadows or lighting artifacts, but shapes that looked almost human, visible at the edges of the frame or in the spaces between archival shelving units. At first, I assumed it was a technical issue. Old fluorescent lights can create strange effects in photography, and the basement's stone walls might have been reflecting light in unexpected ways. I adjusted my camera settings and continued shooting, paying closer attention to the backgrounds of my compositions. But the shadows kept appearing, and they were becoming more defined with each photograph. In one shot of the archival filing system, I captured what clearly looked like a figure standing behind the metal shelving, visible through the gaps between stored document boxes. In another photo of the original stonework, there was a shadow on the wall that resembled someone watching from the corner of the room. I lowered my camera and looked around the basement carefully. I was definitely alone. The space wasn't large enough to hide multiple people, and I would have heard footsteps or movement on the stone floor. But my camera was consistently capturing images of figures that I couldn't see with my naked eye. I switched to continuous shooting mode and took a rapid series of photos while slowly rotating in place, documenting every angle of the basement. When I reviewed the images on my camera's screen, I saw them clearly, at least 6 distinct figures positioned throughout the archives, all appearing to watch me with the kind of focused attention that made my skin crawl. They were dressed in clothing from different historical periods, long dresses and formal coats that belonged to the late 1800s, simpler work clothes that might have dated to the early 1900s, even some outfits that looked more contemporary but still decades out of date. Like a gathering of people from different eras who had somehow converged in this underground space. The most unsettling thing was their body language. They all appeared to be facing toward me, following my movements as I worked through the space. In the sequence of photos I'd taken while rotating, I could see them shifting position, turning to maintain visual contact as I changed my angle. I was photographing an audience I couldn't see. I should have left immediately, should have gathered my equipment and headed back upstairs to the safety of natural light and rational explanations. But I'm a blogger, and this was potentially the most extraordinary documentation I'd ever captured. If these images were authentic, if I wasn't experiencing some kind of elaborate technical malfunction, I had evidence of something genuinely unexplainable. I kept shooting. I moved through the archives methodically, taking both wide shots and close-ups, building a comprehensive visual record of whatever was happening in that basement. The figures appeared in almost every frame, sometimes clearly visible, sometimes just as suggestions at the edges of the composition. But they were consistent, present, and apparently interested in my documentation process. As I worked, I started noticing other details that my initial survey had missed. Personal items scattered among the archival materials, a pair of glasses on top of a filing cabinet, a fountain pen left beside an open ledger book, a woman's glove draped over the back of a chair, items that looked like they'd been left behind recently, but with the patina of age that comes from decades of abandonment. And the temperature in the basement was dropping. I'd started my photography session comfortably warm in my sweater, but the space was growing noticeably colder as the afternoon progressed. Cold enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled, even though the building's heating system had been running when I arrived. The figures in my photographs were becoming more active. Instead of simply standing and watching, they appeared to be moving through the space, approaching closer to my position, reaching toward the camera with gestures that seemed curious rather than threatening, like they were trying to understand what I was doing or perhaps trying to communicate something through my photographic process. In one particularly clear image, I captured a woman in a long Victorian dress standing directly beside me, her face turned toward the camera with an expression of gentle interest. She appeared to be looking at my camera's display screen, studying the images I was taking of her and her companions. That's when I realized I was documenting some kind of ongoing gathering. These weren't random spiritual phenomena or historical echoes. They were people, or the essence of people, who were actively present in this basement, using it for purposes that had nothing to do with the Historical Society's archival work. I took my final photographs rapidly, including several shots of myself using the camera's timer function. I wanted to document my own presence in the space, to create a record of the living person who had witnessed whatever this gathering represented. When I reviewed those final images, I found the one that still keeps me awake at night. In the last self-portrait I took, I can see myself clearly, standing in the center of the archives, surrounded by filing cabinets and document boxes, camera in hand, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who's just completed a successful photography session. But behind me, so close that we're almost touching, stands a figure I hadn't noticed while setting up the shot. A tall man in clothes from the 1920s or 1930s, reaching toward me with arms that seem unnaturally long, fingers extended as if he's about to place his hands on my shoulders. His face is turned toward the camera, and his expression isn't curious or gentle like the others I'd photographed. He looks hungry, desperate, like he's been waiting for decades for someone to come close enough to touch. I packed my equipment and left the building immediately. I dropped the key through the mail slot as instructed and drove home in a state of shock that took hours to process. When I uploaded the photos to my computer that evening, I found that most of them showed the basement exactly as it should appear. Empty archives with no unexplained shadows or figures. But a dozen images remained unchanged. A dozen clear, undeniable photographs of people who shouldn't exist, gathered in a basement that serves as something more than a historical archive. I never published the blog article about the Millfield Historical Society building. Instead, I deleted the photos and tried to forget about the afternoon I'd spent documenting an audience I couldn't see, but I kept one image. The final self-portrait with the figure reaching toward me from behind. I keep it as a reminder of how close I came to something I don't understand, and how lucky I was to leave when I did, because sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed longer, if I'd tried to communicate with the people I was photographing. Would I have become part of their gathering? Another figure in someone else's photographs, reaching out from the shadows of a basement that exists in multiple time periods simultaneously? I drive past that building sometimes, and I always check to see if the basement windows show any signs of activity. Usually they're dark, just as you'd expect from an underground archive space, but occasionally I see lights moving down there. Not the steady glow of fluorescent fixtures, but the warm, flickering illumination that comes from candles or oil lamps. And sometimes, if I slow down and look carefully, I can see figures moving past those windows. People in period clothing going about business that has nothing to do with preserving local history. I wonder if they're still gathering. I wonder if they miss having their photographer. And I wonder if someday they'll find another blogger curious enough to document spaces that exist in more than one era at the same time. But it won't be me. I've learned to appreciate history from a safer distance. Story 5. The archive request. I couldn't find the door. I'd been walking in the same straight line for what felt like 20 minutes, passing filing cabinets I recognized, but the layout kept changing around me. The corridors that had been clearly defined when I arrived were now a maze of metal shelving and storage boxes, and somewhere in the darkness between the rows, something was breathing that wasn't me. Deep, patient breaths that seemed to follow my movements, always staying just out of sight behind the next row of files. My name is Morgan, and I work as a professional genealogist. I've been tracing family histories for 12 years, and most of that work involves spending long hours in archive rooms, courthouse basements, and historical society storage areas. I'm comfortable in underground spaces filled with old records. It comes with the territory when you're trying to piece together the lives of people who died decades or centuries ago. Last month, I received a research request that required access to birth and death records stored in the basement of the Hartwell County Historical Building. The building dates back to 1892, originally constructed as a courthouse annex, and it houses some of the oldest vital records in the region. Records that haven't been digitized yet, the kind of primary source materials that serious genealogical research depends on. The client was paying premium rates for comprehensive research on her family line, with particular interest in deaths that occurred between 1890 and 1920. She'd hit dead ends with online databases and needed someone who could access physical records that might contain information missing from standard genealogical websites. I contacted the Hartwell County Archives to request a research appointment. The archivist, a woman named Patricia Wells, scheduled me for a Thursday afternoon session with access to their vital records collection. She mentioned that I'd be working in the basement storage area, but assured me that the materials I needed were well organized and clearly labeled. "You'll have the research room to yourself," she'd said during our phone conversation. "We don't get many people requesting access to those particular records, so you won't be disturbed by other researchers." She met me at the building's main entrance that Thursday afternoon and led me through a brief orientation about handling procedures for historical documents. The basement access was through a door behind the main circulation desk, secured with a key that looked like it hadn't been updated since the building's original construction. "The records room is at the far end of the basement," Patricia explained as we descended a narrow staircase that seemed to go deeper than necessary for a typical basement level. "Everything's organized chronologically, then alphabetically within each year." The basement was larger than I'd expected, with a ceiling high enough to accommodate tall filing cabinets and a layout that extended much further back than the building's main floor footprint suggested. The record storage area was organized efficiently, with clearly labeled sections that would make my research straightforward. "I'll be upstairs until 5 p.m. if you need anything," Patricia continued, handing me a small table lamp to supplement the overhead lighting. She left me alone with several decades of vital records, and the particular silence that comes with being underground in a space designed for long-term storage rather than human comfort. I started with the death records from 1890, looking for information about my client's great-great-grandmother, who had reportedly died in childbirth but whose death certificate had never been located through standard searches. The filing system was exactly as Patricia had described, organized chronologically and alphabetically, easy to navigate for someone familiar with archival research methods. But after about 30 minutes of work, I noticed something that didn't make sense. The filing cabinets were arranged in rows that created narrow corridors through the storage area. When I'd first arrived, I'd walked straight from the entrance to the death records section, passing 3 intersecting aisles that branched off to other parts of the collection. A simple, logical layout that I'd mentally mapped for efficient research movement. But when I looked up from the 1892 death certificates, the intersecting aisles seemed to be in different positions. The corridor I'd walked down to reach my current location appeared to continue much further than I remembered, disappearing into darkness beyond the range of the overhead lighting. I attributed it to research focus. When you're absorbed in document examination, it's easy to lose track of your spatial surroundings. I made a mental note of the correct path back to the entrance and continued with my work. An hour later, I'd found several useful documents and was ready to examine birth records from the same time period. According to Patricia's orientation, birth records were stored on the left side of the room, which should have been a simple walk across the central aisle. But when I stood up and looked around, I couldn't identify a clear path to the birth records section. The filing cabinets seemed to be arranged in a more complex pattern than I'd initially observed, with additional rows and intersections that created a maze-like layout instead of the straightforward organization I'd been expecting. I walked toward where the birth record should have been located, using the table lamp to illuminate the section labels on each filing cabinet. But instead of finding birth certificates from the 1890s, I found myself in an area containing land deeds from the 1940s, then property tax records from the 1960s, then a section of marriage licenses from the 1970s. Each time I tried to retrace my path back to the death records section where I'd been working, I found myself in a different area of the basement entirely. The layout wasn't just confusing, it was actively changing around me, like the filing cabinets were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stopped walking and took a systematic approach to mapping my location. I could see the overhead fluorescence extending in a straight line above the central corridor, which should have provided a clear navigation reference back to the entrance. But when I followed the lights, they seemed to curve and branch in directions that didn't match the building's architectural structure. That's when I heard the breathing. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the ambient sound of the building's ventilation system. But it was clearly respiratory. Deep, steady inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere among the filing cabinets. Not the mechanical rhythm of HVAC equipment, but the organic pattern of something alive and patient. I stood perfectly still, listening carefully, trying to determine the source and distance of the sound. It seemed to be coming from multiple locations behind me to my left, somewhere in the darkness beyond the range of my table lamp, like multiple entities breathing in coordinated rhythm, surrounding me in the narrow spaces between the record storage units. I called out, thinking maybe Patricia had come down to check on my progress and I hadn't heard her approach. "Hello?" No response. But the breathing continued steady and unhurried, with the quality of something that had been waiting patiently and was now aware that I'd finally noticed its presence. I decided to find the exit immediately. I chose what appeared to be the most direct path toward the entrance, following the overhead lighting and keeping track of my movements to avoid walking in circles. But after 10 minutes of careful navigation, I found myself in a section of the basement I hadn't seen before, older filing cabinets with handwritten labels, storage boxes that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades, and a musty smell that suggested this area had been sealed off from regular access for years. The breathing was getting closer, Not louder, but more immediate, like whatever was producing it had begun moving through the maze of filing cabinets, tracking my location as I tried to find my way out. I checked my phone for the time and discovered something that made my situation much more concerning. According to my phone, it was 7:30 p.m. I'd been in the basement for over 3 hours, even though my research had felt like it lasted maybe 90 minutes. Somehow, I'd lost nearly 2 hours without realizing it. Patricia had left the building at 5 p.m. I was alone in a basement that seemed to be larger than physically possible, surrounded by the sound of breathing that belonged to entities I couldn't see in a space where time moved differently than it should. I increased my pace, no longer trying to navigate systematically, but simply looking for any sign of the entrance or the staircase that had brought me down to this level. The filing cabinets seemed to extend infinitely in every direction, creating corridors that branched and merged in patterns that violated basic architectural logic. The overhead lighting was becoming less reliable. Several fluorescent fixtures were flickering or had gone dark entirely, creating pools of shadow between the illuminated sections, and in those shadows I could see movement, not distinct shapes, but the suggestion of figures moving parallel to my path, keeping pace as I searched for an exit. The breathing was now coming from directly behind me, close enough that I could feel warm air on the back of my neck when I paused to check my direction. But every time I turned around, I saw only empty corridors stretching back into darkness. I started running, not panic, but purposeful movement toward what I hoped was the exit. I followed the brightest fluorescent lights, avoided the areas where the shadows seemed most active, and tried to ignore the sound of footsteps that matched my pace but belonged to someone or something I couldn't see. After what felt like another hour of searching, I found something that gave me hope. A section of the basement with newer filing cabinets and better lighting. Clearly the main research area where I'd started my work. I recognized the death records from 1890 that I'd been examining, still spread across the table where I'd left them. But when I looked for the entrance, the corridor that should have led directly to the staircase instead curved away into another section of storage. The layout had changed again, and what had been a straight path to the exit was now part of the maze that seemed designed to keep me underground indefinitely. I sat down at the research table and tried to think logically about my situation. I was in a basement that was larger than the building above it. I was surrounded by entities that breathed but couldn't be seen. Time was moving differently than it should, and the only exit seemed to be shifting location every time I tried to find it. Either I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency that was affecting my perception and memory, or I was trapped in a space that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with normal architecture or physics. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of searching for the exit, I would wait for whatever was sharing the basement with me to reveal itself. If there were entities down here, if they had been guiding me away from the exit, perhaps they had something they wanted to communicate. I turned off my table lamp and sat in the darkness listening to the breathing that surrounded me. Within minutes, I heard movement much closer than before. Footsteps on the concrete floor, the rustle of clothing, the sound of something being moved or rearranged among the filing cabinets. And gradually I began to see lights, not electric illumination, but the warm glow of what looked like candles or oil lamps appearing in the spaces between storage units. The lights revealed figures moving through the basement. People dressed in clothing from different historical periods, carrying documents and record books, working among the filing cabinets with the focused attention of researchers engaged in important projects. They weren't threatening. They were archivists, librarians, record keepers from different eras who had found their way into this basement and had been continuing their work in the spaces between normal time and geography. The breathing I'd been hearing was simply the sound of people absorbed in research, the collective respiration of scholars who had never stopped pursuing the information they'd been seeking in life. One of them approached my table, an elderly woman in a long dress from the early 1900s, carrying a leather-bound ledger that she placed carefully beside my client's research materials. She spoke in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, even though she was standing directly next to me. "You're looking for Sarah Catherine Morrison. Died April 15, 1893. Childbirth complications." She opened the ledger and showed me a handwritten entry that contained exactly the information I'd been hired to find. Not just the death certificate, but additional details about the circumstances, the attending physician, and the burial location. Information that would have taken me weeks to piece together through conventional research methods. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure if she could hear me or if this interaction was happening in the same reality where I'd started my research. She smiled and gestured toward a corridor I hadn't noticed before, one that led directly to a staircase I recognized as the entrance I'd been searching for. "The exit is always there," she said. I gathered my materials and the information she'd provided, then walked toward the staircase. When I reached the entrance and looked back, the basement appeared exactly as it had when I'd first arrived. A straightforward layout with clearly organized filing sections and reasonable overhead lighting. The breathing had stopped, the candle lights had disappeared, and according to my phone, it was 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Patricia was scheduled to leave the building. I found her upstairs preparing to lock up for the day. She asked if I'd found everything I needed, and I showed her the notes I'd taken about Sarah Catherine Morrison's death certificate. "Oh, that's from the supplemental records," she said, reviewing my information. "Those are stored in a separate section that most researchers never need to access." I had help, I told her, which was the truth, even if I couldn't explain what kind of help it had been. I completed my client's research project with the information I'd been given in that basement. The death certificate was exactly where the woman in the long dress had said it would be, filed separately in a section that wasn't included in standard archival searches. But I've never requested access to basement records again, because I understand now that some archives exist in more than one time period simultaneously, staffed by researchers who never finish their work and who continue their projects in spaces where normal rules don't apply. And sometimes, if you're patient enough to let them help, they'll share information that no living archivist could provide. But you have to be prepared for the possibility that once you enter their research space, you might not find the exit until they decide your work is complete. I still have nightmares about walking in circles through endless filing cabinets, surrounded by the breathing of invisible researchers who know exactly what I'm looking for, but won't tell me where to find it. Sometimes I wake up holding documents I don't remember retrieving, filled with information I couldn't have discovered through normal research methods. Story 6. The Photographer's Commission. The photograph showed me standing in the basement with my back to the camera, but I'd been alone the entire time. There was no one else in that building who could have taken that picture, yet there I was in the frame, completely unaware that someone or something was documenting my work from behind, close enough to capture the concentration on my face as I adjusted my camera settings. When I saw that image on my computer screen later that night, I realized I'd spent 3 hours being watched and photographed by an invisible presence that had been studying my every movement. I'm Ryan, and I've been working as a freelance architectural photographer for 8 years. I specialize in interior documentation for historic preservation projects, the kind of detailed photography that architects and historians need when they're planning renovations or creating visual records of significant buildings. The commission came through my website in late October. A property management company was preparing to renovate a historic community building that had been purchased by a local arts organization. They needed comprehensive interior photography before construction began, with particular emphasis on architectural details that might be affected by the renovation process. The building was impressive, a 3-story stone structure built in 1888, originally designed as a community meeting hall with excellent natural light and soaring ceilings that would photograph beautifully. The site manager, a guy named Tom Fletcher, met me there on a crisp Thursday morning to provide access and explain what they needed documented. "We're particularly interested in the basement spaces," Tom explained as he handed me a set of keys. He led me through a quick walkthrough of the main floors, pointing out details that the architects wanted documented. Original window casements, decorative molding, the intricate woodwork around the main staircase. Standard architectural photography, the kind of work I'd done dozens of times before. "The basement is accessed through that door behind the reception area," he continued, indicating a heavy wooden door that looked original to the building. Tom seemed slightly nervous as he explained the basement access, checking his watch and mentioning that he had other appointments that afternoon. "I won't be able to stay with you through the whole session," he said. "Just lock up when you're finished and leave the keys in the lockbox by the main entrance." Something about his tone suggested that privacy wasn't entirely a positive thing, but I attributed his nervousness to the usual anxiety that property managers feel when leaving contractors alone in valuable buildings. I started with the main floors, methodically documenting the architectural features that Tom had indicated. The natural light was excellent, and the building's original craftsmanship provided exactly the kind of detail work that makes for compelling preservation photography. I was getting shots that would definitely satisfy the client's documentation requirements. Around noon, I headed down to the basement to tackle the lower-level photography. The basement was indeed larger than I'd expected, with stone walls and arched ceilings that suggested serious architectural ambition in the original construction. The space was filled with stored furniture and equipment from the building's previous incarnation as a community meeting hall. Old chairs, folding tables, a collection of podiums and display boards that had clearly been accumulating for decades. But the architecture was stunning. The stonework was original 1880s craftsmanship, with fitted blocks and archways that modern contractors would charge premium prices to replicate. The lighting was challenging, minimal windows near the ceiling and old fluorescent fixtures that cast uneven shadows. But that just meant I'd need to use my portable strobes to capture the details properly. I set up my equipment and started with wide shots of the overall space, then moved to detail photography of the stonework and architectural features. The basement would definitely make an impressive gallery space once the stored furniture was cleared out and proper lighting was installed. About an hour into the basement session, I started noticing technical problems with my camera equipment. My strobes were firing randomly, even when I wasn't triggering them. At first, I thought it was a wireless connectivity issue. Sometimes radio-controlled flashes can be triggered by interference from other electronic devices. But the building was empty, and I wasn't using any other wireless equipment that could cause interference. The random flash firing was creating interesting lighting effects, but it was also disrupting my planned shots. I'd compose a photograph carefully, set up the lighting exactly as I wanted it, then have the strobes fire unexpectedly while I was still adjusting my camera position. Then my camera started taking pictures by itself. I'd be reviewing images on the LCD screen when I'd hear the shutter click, indicating that another photograph had been captured. Not the random firing I might expect from a malfunctioning trigger, but deliberate, precisely timed shots that seemed to be documenting something I wasn't consciously photographing. I checked my camera settings, thinking I might have accidentally enabled some kind of automatic shooting mode, but everything was configured normally. Single shot mode, manual focus, no timer functions activated. The camera shouldn't have been taking pictures without me pressing the shutter release. But every few minutes I'd hear that distinctive shutter sound, and when I checked the image count, I'd find new photographs that I didn't remember taking. I decided to review the unintentional images to see if there was some technical explanation for what was happening. Maybe the camera was responding to vibrations in the building, or perhaps there was an electronic interference issue that was causing the shutter mechanism to activate randomly. Most of the mystery photographs were standard architectural shots, angles and compositions similar to what I'd been intentionally capturing, but from slightly different positions. Like someone had been following my work pattern and taking their own versions of my planned shots. But one image was completely different from anything I'd been photographing. It showed me standing in the basement with my back to the camera, completely absorbed in adjusting my strobe lighting. The photo was taken from about 10 feet behind me, at a slight angle that provided a clear view of my face in profile as I worked. The lighting was perfect, the composition was professional quality, and the timing captured a moment of complete concentration on my work. The problem was that no one else was in the building. I was alone in that basement, and I hadn't set up any remote camera equipment that could take photographs from that position and angle. Someone, or something, had been standing behind me, watching me work, and had taken a professionally composed photograph of me without my knowledge. I immediately stopped what I was doing and searched the entire basement. Checked behind every piece of stored furniture, examined every corner and alcove, looked for any evidence of another person or any equipment that could explain the mysterious photograph. The basement was empty, completely empty, except for the stored furniture and my own photography equipment. I called Tom Fletcher to ask if anyone else had access to the building during my photography session. The call went straight to voicemail, so I left a message explaining the situation and asking him to call me back immediately. While I waited for his response, I continued my work but paid much closer attention to my camera's behavior. The random strobe firing continued, and I kept hearing the shutter click at unexpected moments. But now I was watching carefully to see if I could identify any pattern or trigger for the unwanted photographs. What I discovered was more unsettling than random technical malfunctions. The mysterious photos were being taken at moments when I was most absorbed in my work, when I was focused on complicated lighting setups, when I was examining architectural details through my viewfinder, when my attention was completely occupied by technical photography tasks. It was like someone was studying my work methods, documenting my professional techniques, learning how I approached architectural photography by capturing images of me in action. And the quality of the photographs was excellent. Professional composition, perfect timing, technical settings that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of photography. Whoever was taking these pictures knew what they were doing. I packed up my equipment and left the basement immediately. I completed the rest of the architectural documentation on the main floors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed throughout the remainder of the session. Every time I set up a shot, every time I adjusted my camera settings, I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking for evidence of the invisible photographer who had been documenting my work in the basement. When I got home that evening, I uploaded all the photographs to my computer for post-processing. Most of the images were exactly what I'd expected, professional architectural documentation suitable for the client's renovation planning purposes. But mixed in with my intentional work were dozens of photographs I hadn't taken. Images of me working throughout the building, captured from angles and positions that would have required another photographer to be present during my entire session. The pictures showed me from behind, from the side, from elevated positions that suggested the photographer had been standing on furniture or architectural features to get better vantage points. In every image, I appeared completely unaware of being photographed, absorbed in my work and oblivious to the presence of someone documenting my every professional move. The final photograph in the sequence was the most disturbing. It showed me standing at my car in the building's parking lot, loading my equipment into the trunk at the end of my session. The photo was taken from inside the building through one of the main floor windows, capturing my departure with the same professional quality and careful composition that characterized all the mysterious images. Whoever had been photographing me had followed me throughout the entire building, documenting not just my work but my exit from the property. They had watched me leave, and they had taken a final picture to record the moment when their subject departed their territory. I never delivered those photographs to the client. I called Tom Fletcher the next morning and told him that technical problems had compromised the photography session, that I'd need to reschedule for a different day with backup equipment. But when I called back a week later to set up a new appointment, the number had been disconnected. I drove by the building a month later and found it empty with no signs of renovation activity. The arts organization that was supposed to be converting it into gallery space apparently never materialized, and the property management company that had hired me seemed to have disappeared entirely. But sometimes I still receive photography assignments that come through my website, jobs that involve documenting historic buildings with particular emphasis on basement spaces. The emails always mention excellent pay for relatively simple architectural work, and they always emphasize that I'll have complete privacy to work without interruption. I don't accept those commissions anymore. Because I know now that some buildings have their own photographers, invisible presences that are more interested in documenting the people who visit their spaces than in preserving architectural details for renovation purposes. And sometimes late at night when I'm processing photographs from other jobs, I find images in my files that I don't remember taking. Pictures of me working in various locations, always shot from behind, always capturing moments when I'm completely absorbed in my craft. Someone is still documenting my work. Someone who learned my techniques during that afternoon in the basement, who studied my professional methods through careful observation and precise photography. I just hope they're satisfied with remote documentation, because I never want to meet my invisible colleague face to face. Story 7. The building inspector. Behind the newly bricked wall, something was tapping back. Not the random settling of old pipes or the mechanical rhythm of building systems, but a deliberate pattern that matched my own test taps exactly. When I knocked 3 times on the fresh mortar, something on the other side responded with 3 identical knocks. When I tried a complex rhythm, tap, tap, pause, tap, it was perfectly replicated from within the sealed space, like someone had been waiting decades for the chance to communicate through that makeshift barrier. My name's Blake, and I've been working as a city building inspector for 15 years. I've crawled through more basements, attics, and foundation spaces than I care to count, examining structural integrity and code compliance in buildings that range from brand new construction to historical properties that predate modern safety standards. The inspection request came through normal channels, a routine structural assessment for a 19th century meeting hall that was being considered for conversion into commercial retail space. The property owner needed city approval for the change of use, which required me to evaluate the building's foundation, electrical systems, and overall structural soundness. I'd dealt with the property owner before, a local real estate developer named Marcus Webb, who specialized in historic renovations. Marcus had a reputation for cutting corners when he thought he could get away with it, but he usually brought buildings up to code when inspection reports gave him no choice. When I called to schedule the inspection, Marcus seemed unusually eager to accommodate my schedule. "Any day that works for you, Blake," he'd said, which was different from his usual pattern of trying to delay inspections until the last possible moment. He also made a specific point of mentioning the building's basement condition. "The foundation is solid," he said before I'd even asked about it. "Really excellent stonework from the 1870s, built to last." Something about his tone suggested he was more concerned about the basement than he was letting on. But property owners always have anxiety about structural inspections that might delay their projects or require expensive modifications. I arrived at the building on a Tuesday morning, and Marcus met me at the main entrance with the keys and a basic floor plan. The building was impressive. 3 stories of solid stone construction with the kind of architectural details that modern developers pay premium prices to replicate. "Take your time with the inspection," Marcus said as he led me through the main floor. He showed me the electrical panels and pointed out some recent plumbing updates, then handed me a flashlight and the basement access key. "The basement stairs are a little steep," he mentioned as I prepared to head down. "Original construction, you know." He left so quickly that I wondered if he was avoiding something about the basement inspection. But property developers often have tight schedules that don't allow time for following inspectors around their buildings. I started with the main floor systems, checking electrical compliance and noting a few minor code updates that would be required for the retail conversion. Standard inspection work, nothing that would prevent the change of use approval. Around 10 a.m. I headed down to examine the foundation and basement structure. The basement was larger than the building's main floor footprint suggested, with stone walls that demonstrated the kind of craftsmanship that belonged in architectural preservation guides. The foundation was indeed solid, fitted stone blocks that had been laid with precision that modern contractors would struggle to match. But as I worked my way around the perimeter, conducting the systematic examination that structural inspections require, I found something that didn't belong in a building from the 1870s. A section of the east wall had been bricked up recently, not repaired or maintained, but completely sealed with new bricks and fresh mortar that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The work was professional quality, but it was clearly an addition to the original foundation rather than part of the building's historical construction. According to the floor plan Marcus had provided, that section of the wall should have contained a storage alcove or utility access, not a solid barrier. Someone had sealed off a portion of the basement without noting the modification in the building's documentation. I knocked on the wall to test the density and thickness of the new construction. The sound suggested that there was a significant space behind the bricks. Not just a shallow alcove, but a room or corridor that extended back into the darkness beyond my flashlight's range. That's when I heard the response. 3 clear knocks from the other side of the wall, perfectly timed to match my own test taps. Not an echo or acoustic reflection, but a deliberate reply that came from something capable of conscious communication. I stepped back from the wall and listened carefully. Old buildings make all sorts of settling noises, and basement acoustics can create strange effects that seem to come from impossible locations. But the knocking I'd heard was too immediate and too precise to be explained by mechanical building systems. I tried a more complex test. I knocked on the wall in a specific pattern. 2 quick taps, a pause, then 3 slower knocks. The pattern was replicated exactly from behind the bricks, as if someone on the other side had been listening carefully and was responding to my communication attempt. I called out, thinking maybe there was a utility worker or maintenance person who had access to a space behind the wall that I didn't know about. "Hello?" No vocal response, but another series of knocks that seemed to acknowledge my question. Rapid, urgent tapping that suggested someone was trying to get my attention, trying to communicate through the barrier that separated us. I examined the brickwork more closely with my flashlight. The mortar was definitely fresh, and the construction quality suggested someone who knew what they were doing. but there were no obvious access points, no doors or openings that would allow someone to enter the space behind the wall. More disturbing was what I found when I looked at the floor near the base of the wall. Scratches in the concrete like someone had been clawing or scraping at the foundation from the other side, and stains that looked like they might be rust or something else that had seeped through the stone over time. I knocked again, this time using the standard code pattern that emergency responders use to communicate with people trapped in collapsed buildings. The response was immediate and desperate. Rapid, continuous knocking that went on for almost a full minute, coming from multiple locations behind the wall like several people were trying to signal their presence simultaneously. But that was impossible. According to the building plans, there shouldn't be any space behind that wall large enough to contain multiple people. And even if there was, how would they have gotten there? The brickwork was solid, sealed from this side with no visible access points. I called Marcus Webb immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining that I'd found an undocumented modification to the basement and needed information about what space might exist behind the newly bricked wall. While I waited for his callback, I continued my structural inspection of the rest of the basement. But I kept hearing sounds from behind that wall. Not just knocking, but scraping, scratching, and what sounded like movement of heavy objects being dragged across stone surfaces. By the time I finished examining the foundation and mechanical systems, I was convinced that someone was trapped in a space that shouldn't exist, trying to communicate through a barrier that had been constructed to keep them sealed away from the rest of the building. I called the fire department. I explained the situation to the emergency dispatcher. Potential people trapped behind a wall in a basement, responding to knocking but unable to communicate verbally. The dispatcher treated it as a possible rescue situation and sent a response team with equipment for accessing confined spaces. The firefighters arrived within 20 minutes, bringing tools for breaking through walls and detecting signs of life in enclosed spaces. When I led them down to the basement and demonstrated the knocking communication, they immediately began preparing to breach the wall. "This is definitely someone responding to us," the team leader said after testing the communication pattern. They started with small openings, drilling pilot holes to assess the space behind the wall and check for hazardous gases or unstable structural conditions. The first hole revealed that there was indeed a significant space behind the bricks, a room or corridor that extended back beyond the range of their inspection cameras. But when they expanded the opening enough to shine lights into the space, they found something that none of us had expected. The area behind the wall was a finished room, complete with stone flooring, fitted walls, and evidence of long-term occupation. Old furniture, personal belongings, and signs that someone had been living in that space for an extended period of time. But the room was empty. No people, no evidence of recent occupation, no explanation for the knocking and scraping sounds that we'd all heard clearly just minutes before. The firefighters conducted a thorough search of the hidden room and found access to additional spaces that extended far beyond the building's supposed foundation footprint. A network of interconnected chambers that had been carved into the bedrock beneath the meeting hall, creating an underground complex that wasn't shown on any architectural plans. In one of the deeper chambers, they found evidence of multiple people who had been living in the underground spaces, personal belongings, sleeping areas, food storage, and a communication system that allowed residents to signal to each other through knocking patterns transmitted through the stone walls. But everyone was gone. The spaces were empty, recently abandoned, like the residents had left just before our arrival. Marcus Webb never returned my calls. When I tried to reach him later that week to file my inspection report, I learned that he'd sold the building immediately after my inspection and had relocated his business to another state. The new property owner hired a different inspector and submitted a modified renovation plan that didn't include any commercial conversion of the basement level. But I know what I heard behind that wall. I know there were people in those underground spaces, people who had been living there for months or maybe years. People who had been sealed behind a brick barrier by someone who knew exactly what he was hiding. And sometimes I wonder if they found another way out of those underground chambers, or if they're still down there in the network of spaces that extends beneath other buildings in the historic district, still communicating through knocking patterns that echo through stone walls in basements throughout the city. Because since that inspection, I've started hearing similar sounds in other old buildings. Knocking that responds to my own test taps, scraping behind walls that shouldn't contain hidden spaces. Evidence of people living in areas that building plans insist are solid foundation. I don't investigate those sounds anymore. I complete my inspections quickly and file reports that focus on code compliance rather than architectural mysteries. But I always knock back when I hear the signals, because I think there are people living in the forgotten spaces beneath our city, and maybe acknowledging their presence is the only way to let them know that someone in the world above still knows they exist. I just hope they never decide they want to come upstairs. Story 8. The overnight security job. From the darkness below, I heard footsteps starting to climb the stairs, not the hurried scrambling of someone caught trespassing, but the slow, deliberate pace of something that had been waiting patiently for me to discover that unlocked door. Each step echoed against the stone walls with a weight that suggested this wasn't the first time something had climbed those stairs from the basement darkness. And the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too measured, like whatever was climbing had all the time in the world to reach the main floor where I stood frozen, finally understanding why I'd been warned never to open that door after midnight. My name's Austin, and I took the weekend security job at the Riverside Community Arts Center because the pay was good and the work was straightforward. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, check door locks, monitor the alarm system, and make sure nothing got stolen or vandalized during the overnight hours when the building was supposed to be empty. The Arts Center operates out of a converted historical building that used to serve various civic functions over the past century and a half. During the day, it hosts community theater productions, art classes, and small cultural events. At night, it was supposed to be just me and the security system keeping watch over a building full of creative equipment and art supplies. The job interview was brief and focused mainly on logistics, my availability for weekend overnight shifts, my experience with basic security procedures, my comfort level with working alone in old buildings. The facility manager, a woman named Linda Martinez, seemed more interested in finding someone reliable than someone with extensive security experience. "It's not a complicated job," she'd explained as she showed me around the main floor during my orientation. "The building is well secured and we've never had any serious incidents." She'd handed me a set of keys and walked me through the basic security rounds, checking exterior doors, monitoring the alarm panel, making note of any unusual sounds or activities in the logbook that I'd sign at the end of each shift. "The main thing is staying alert and making sure everything stays locked up," Linda continued as we finished the walkthrough. She led me to a heavy wooden door behind the reception area that I hadn't noticed during the initial tour. "This leads to the basement storage area," she explained, indicating a door that looked original to the building's construction. "But it should never be opened after midnight." When I asked why, she seemed uncomfortable providing details. "The basement has some temperature control issues that affect the building's heating system overnight. Opening that door after midnight can cause problems with the HVAC equipment that are expensive to repair." That seemed like an odd restriction, but old buildings often have quirky mechanical systems that require specific operational procedures. I made note of the basement door policy and figured it would be easy enough to avoid one area of the building during my security rounds. My first weekend went exactly as Linda had described. Arrive at 10 p.m., receive a briefing from the evening staff member who locked up the main floor, then settle in for an overnight shift of periodic security checks and quiet building monitoring. The art center was peaceful at night, the kind of comfortable quiet that comes with thick walls and the absence of daytime activity. I spent most of the time reading or catching up on podcasts, taking walks around the perimeter every 2 hours to check locks and make sure everything remained secure. The basement door stayed locked, just as Linda had instructed. I tested the handle during each round to confirm it was secure, but I never had any reason to consider opening it. But on my second weekend, I started hearing sounds from below. It began around 1 a.m. on Saturday night. I was doing my routine security check when I heard what sounded like movement in the basement. Not mechanical sounds like heating system operation, but deliberate activity. Footsteps, the scraping of furniture being moved, sounds that suggested someone was active in the space below. My first thought was that someone had broken into the building through a basement entrance I didn't know about. The sounds were too organized and purposeful to be explained by building systems or settling noises. Someone was down there moving around in a space that was supposed to be empty and secure. I stood by the basement door, listening carefully to determine the nature and location of the activity below. The sounds were coming from directly beneath the main floor, which meant someone was in the basement storage area that Linda had warned me never to access after midnight. I called the emergency number Linda had provided for security incidents, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking for guidance about potential basement intrusion, but I needed to make a decision about how to respond immediately. The standard security protocol for potential break-ins was to call the police and avoid confrontation with intruders. But I couldn't call the police about basement activity without first confirming that someone had actually gained unauthorized access. For all I knew, there might be automated systems or scheduled maintenance that I hadn't been told about. I tested the basement door handle, still locked from my side just as it had been during my previous security checks. But locks can be picked, and there might be basement entrances from outside the building that would allow access without going through the main floor door. The sounds from below were getting louder and more frequent. Definitely footsteps, definitely furniture or equipment being moved around. Activity that suggested multiple people working on some kind of project in the basement storage area. I made the decision to investigate. I unlocked the basement door and opened it slowly, listening for any change in the activity below that might indicate the intruders had heard me accessing their location. The sounds stopped immediately. Complete silence from the basement, like everyone down there had suddenly become aware that someone was listening from above. I called down the stairs, identifying myself as building security and asking anyone in the basement to respond. "This is building security." No response. But the silence felt different from the absence of activity. It felt like people who were actively choosing not to respond, people who were waiting to see what I would do next. I descended the stairs with my flashlight, moving slowly and keeping my phone ready to call police if I encountered intruders who posed a threat. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with stone walls and multiple storage areas that branched off from a central corridor. The space was clearly original to the building's construction, with the kind of sturdy stonework that belonged in architectural preservation guides. But it was completely empty. No people, no evidence of recent activity, no explanation for the sounds I'd been hearing for the past 20 minutes. I searched the entire basement methodically, checking storage rooms, examining potential hiding places, looking for any evidence of unauthorized access or recent occupation. The space was secure, organized, and definitively empty. But when I started back toward the stairs, I heard sounds from the main floor above. Footsteps in the reception area, doors opening and closing, activity that suggested someone was now moving around in the space I'd just left to investigate the basement. I climbed the stairs quickly, concerned that intruders had used my basement investigation as an opportunity to access the main floor. But when I reached the top of the stairs, the building was as empty and quiet as it had been when I'd started my security round. I checked the entire main floor, tested all exterior doors, confirmed that the alarm system was still armed and functioning normally. No evidence of intrusion, no signs that anyone had been in the building during my basement search. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened while I was downstairs. The building felt different, not violated or disturbed, but changed in a way that I couldn't identify specifically. I returned to my security station and made detailed notes in the logbook about the basement sounds and my investigation. When Linda arrived Monday morning, I planned to get clarification about what might cause activity noises in the basement and whether there were access points I didn't know about. But the sounds continued throughout the rest of the weekend. Every night around 1 a.m., I'd hear movement in the basement, and every time I checked the basement door, I found it unlocked. Not unlocked by me. I was careful about security procedures, and I always made sure to lock that door after checking it during my rounds. But between security checks, the door would become unlocked from the inside, like someone in the basement had access to keys and was deliberately opening the lock from their side. Sunday night, I decided to test what was happening systematically. I locked the basement door at 12:30 a.m. and sat in a position where I could watch it continuously until my next security round at 2:30 a.m. At 1:15 a.m., while I was watching the door directly, I heard the lock mechanism turn. Not picked or forced, but opened normally with a key from the basement side. The door remained closed, but I could tell from the sound that it was no longer locked. And immediately after the lock turned, I heard footsteps starting to climb the stairs from below. Not the hurried movement of someone trying to escape detection, but slow, deliberate steps that suggested whoever was climbing had every right to be there and was in no hurry to avoid being seen. I stood up and approached the door, trying to decide whether to open it and confront whoever was coming upstairs or to call the police and let them handle what was clearly a security situation beyond my training level. The footsteps continued, getting closer to the door with each step, but they were moving too slowly, taking too long to climb what should have been a straightforward staircase. Like whoever was climbing was taking time to consider each step, or was carrying something heavy that required careful movement. I heard them reach the door, but instead of opening it, they stopped. Someone was standing on the other side of that door, waiting. I called out, identifying myself as building security and demanding that the person in the stairway identify themselves and explain their presence in the building. No response. But I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, deep, patient breathing that suggested someone who was completely calm about being discovered in an area they weren't supposed to access. I unlocked the door from my side and pulled it open quickly, hoping to catch whoever was on the stairs before they could retreat back to the basement. The stairway was empty. No one on the stairs, no one visible in the basement corridor below. But the door had definitely been unlocked from the inside, and I had definitely heard someone climbing those stairs just seconds before. I searched the basement again, more thoroughly this time, looking for alternative exits or hiding places that might explain how someone could disappear so quickly. But the basement was as empty and secure as it had been during my previous searches. When I returned to the main floor, I found that someone had left something on my security desk. A key that looked identical to the basement access key I'd been given during my orientation, but older, with the kind of patina that comes from decades of use. and attached to the key was a note, written in careful handwriting that looked like it belonged to an earlier century. Some doors should stay locked. Some spaces should stay empty. I called Linda Martinez immediately despite the late hour. When she answered, she sounded like she'd been expecting my call. She said before I could explain why I was calling. "There were sounds down there," I told her. "There weren't any people down there," Linda said quietly. "There never are." She explained that the arts center had a long history of overnight security guards who couldn't resist investigating the basement sounds. Most of them quit after one or two encounters with whatever lived in the spaces below the main floor. A few had disappeared entirely, leaving only keys and notes that suggested they'd chosen to join whatever community existed in the building's lower levels. "The job is just checking locks and monitoring alarms," Linda said. "Nothing else." I finished my security rounds that night, but I didn't return for the following weekend. I called Linda Monday morning and resigned from the position, citing schedule conflicts that prevented me from continuing the overnight shifts. I drove past the arts center a few months later and saw another security guard walking the perimeter during his evening rounds. Young guy who looked comfortable with the job, probably thinking he'd found easy work in a peaceful building. I wondered if anyone had explained the basement door policy to him yet. I wondered if he'd be curious enough to investigate when he started hearing the sounds from below. And I wondered if someday he'd be the one leaving keys and notes for the next security guard, trying to warn them about the importance of keeping some doors locked and some spaces unexplored. Because I know now that some buildings have residents in addition to tenants. And some jobs come with responsibilities that extend far beyond the duties listed in the employment description. I still have that old key, and sometimes I catch myself wondering what would have happened if I'd used it to go deeper into the basement, to explore the spaces that existed beyond the storage areas I'd searched. But mostly I'm grateful that I was too frightened to find out. Because I think some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some doors are better left unopened, especially after midnight.